Evaluation question 1. In what ways does your media product use, develop or challenge forms and conventions of a real media product? I chose the horror genre as it was possible for me to do on a very low budget. This, and I knew the typical conventions of a horror movie. These both helped me to develop my idea. However, I actually set out to challenge the horror convention, kind of take a different approach by adding an element of romance. However, due to several reasons in filming and editing, it was a lot harder to get across that romantic element in my trailer. So in the end, I mainly used the conventions of a horror film through the stages of post-production. The target audience. My target audience is a typical target audience for a horror movie, so that is one of the ways in which I'm following the conventions of a horror movie. It is aimed at elder teens to young adults, which is typical for horror movies. They're generally aimed at that age group, and they are generally the age group who go and watch these movies. Campaign. However, with my whole campaign, which includes the film magazine front cover, the film's poster and the trailer, there are ways in which I am developing or perhaps even challenging the horror conventions. This is especially with my film magazine front cover, and this is because horror films wouldn't generally tend to advertise themselves on the front of Sight and Sound or Little White Lies, and this is because these magazines don't generally tend to have horror films on the front. They want films with, I don't know, it's films like different films. But mine is on the front for different reasons, which I will talk about later. It's also because the target audience for horror movies don't generally tend to read Sight and Sound and Little White Lies. So by having their picture on the front cover, it's not attracting their audience. It's pointless, really. So I feel like I'm challenging the typical convention for a horror movie because I've managed to get my movie into a Sight and Sound and Little White Lies for different reasons, such as I think as a film art director, and I've won an Edinburgh Film Festival award. So these are reasons why I'm on Sight and Sound and Little White Lies, and it also reaches out to that part of the audience which I've been missing, which horror films generally don't tend to advertise to. So it may be bringing new audiences in to watch this horror film, but for different reasons than the actual target audience generally do watch them for. The style. The general style of my whole 3 products does stick to conventions of horror movies because they're all creepy, there's lots of blood, there's like a scary feel throughout the whole thing, and even at the beginning where you don't know anything bad's going to happen, there's the kind of creepy music in the background. You know something's not going to be right. It's all dark, and then you've got the girl kind of creeping around dark hallways and in the dark bedrooms, and it's just kind of got that whole creepy feel about it, which is a convention for a horror movie. The sounds are quite typical of a horror movie as well. You have the heartbeats, you have the screams, the drones, and kind of the eerie piano going on in the background, which gets heavier and scarier towards the end of the trailer. In my pictures for my poster and my magazine front cover, I've stuck to conventions of a horror movie as she looks scary, she's covered in a lot of blood, it's very, very dark. However, with my Little White Lies one, I've had to go along with the conventions of a typical Little White Lies magazine, which is where it kind of looks as if it's been drawn. This isn't typical for a horror movie. Horror movies generally wouldn't tend to do that to their pictures. But I had to do that so it would fit in with the Little White Lies. With my trailer, there's a way in which I might actually be developing the horror conventions. And this is because generally in horror films it becomes a lot more fast-paced and quickly cut towards the end of the trailer, where everything, starts becoming a lot more scarier, and the music becomes a lot creepier, a lot quicker, a lot more fast-paced. I learnt this by looking at trailers such as The Grudge and Paranormal Activity, and they're very, very fast cut with kind of still images flashing up. My trailer does speed up a little bit towards the end, but not necessarily enough for it to be typical of a horror film. It's still quite slow paced and there's still quite a lot of long scenes in it, and the piano doesn't get much faster, it only gets kind of louder. So that's a way in which I am developing the horror convention in my trailer. The characters. You could say that I'm even sticking to the typical horror conventions with my characters, because in horror movies, if it's a male, they generally tend to be the creepy psycho killers, murderers. They're always the ones doing something to the women. And this is what is happening in mine, because he's the one who's obsessed with her, he's the one who was stalking her, he's the one who, when they were going out, got jealous and hit her and stuff. And that kind of sticks to the male role in horror movies very well. And the female is kind of always made out to be quite vulnerable, which Millie is at the beginning. But also with female characters, if you look at movies like The Ring, The Grudge, Paranormal Activity, The Unborn, they're kind of always dead and scary, but because they're trying to get revenge on a man, or they're possessed by a ghost, or they kind of always have that creepiness about them, and they're generally always the ones who are kind of dead but also still quite vulnerable at the same time. And that's what I've done with my main character Millie. She's just trying to get revenge on her boyfriend who killed her because he was obsessed with her. So altogether, I am generally sticking to the typical horror conventions. However, there are parts and aspects of my projects that do develop and change them in a way.